Hello, hello everyone. I am Suzanne. I'm the founder of the Crafty Cask. We are all about celebrating and supporting craft alcohol makers.
And my name's Evan. I'm a certified sommelier, a certified cider professional, and whiskey enthusiast.
And as part of our corporate events that we do a ton of, gosh, we did 7 this week, I think, we teach whiskey tasting techniques quite a bit. And so we thought we would share our whiskey tasting techniques with all of you. So we're going to walk us through the 5 steps to whiskey tasting techniques, and grab your dram and let's get going.
So these are techniques that can be applied to pretty much beverage tasting across a lot of different categories. There's a few variations that we'll talk about with regard to whiskey and spirits tastings more generally. But basically, there's sight, swirl, sniff, sip, and savor. None of these are done exclusive to others. You go back and forth between them. But initially, the visual inspection of a spirit, or in this case a whiskey, is going to tell you a little bit about the grain characteristic and the aging that might have gone into the whiskey, as well as the barrels that were used to age the whiskey.
Right, so not surprisingly, the darker the whiskey, likely the longer it's spent in a barrel. The lighter the whiskey, likely the less time it's spent in a barrel. That's not 100% accurate all the time, of course. There are always exceptions and variations based on the grains they're using, things of that nature. But that's definitely one thing to kind of glean a little insight on when you're taking a look at your whiskey before you take the next step.
The darker the whiskey, maybe the longer or the more charred and the deeper the toast on the barrel it is, and the lighter, the less.
One other thing you're looking for when you're looking at your spirit for this first step here is how clear it is, or if there's any cloudiness to it. Now, this is something that we like to spend a little bit of time on, because a lot of people, if they see a cloudy spirit, something that isn't perfectly pristine and crystal clear, they think that maybe that doesn't mean it's good quality. But in fact, a lot of craft makers, which you know we are all about at the Crafty Cask, a lot of craft makers choose to non-chill filter their spirits. And if you don't chill filter your spirits, it will indeed have some cloudiness in it at certain temperatures, or you may at certain temperatures see things kind of start to fall out of solution. That is not a bad thing, because when you think about filtration, the more you filter something, the less kind of flavor, mouthfeel, esters, complexity it's pulling out of there. So while we're all very well trained to think like bigger is better, so filtered 5 times, filtered 10 times, right? A lot of us think that is better. That's not necessarily true when it comes to craft spirits. So if you see something that's a little cloudy, or things are falling out of solution a little bit, don't be scared. That might actually mean that there is more flavor and more complexity and more kind of nuance and mouthfeel in that whiskey than those that are super pristine and filtered very heavily and crystal clear.
Very true, very true. Next up there, swirling the whiskey in your glass. This is something that you don't want to necessarily be too vigorous with.
Yeah, with spirits in particular.
Yeah. But moving the liquid around in the glass is going to be exposing more of the surface area of it to the surrounding environment, and it's going to be releasing more of the volatile aromatics, so that when you get to the next step, sniff, there's more there for your nose to pick up on. It just kind of intensifies the smelling of the spirit.
Now we'll give you a quick watch out here as we get to this next step. If you're familiar with tasting wine, and we all stick our nose deep into that glass, as Evan has taught us to do in his wine tasting techniques video.
Slow your roll.
Slow your roll a little bit. You want to do this a little bit more slowly because it's high proof.
Yeah.
So if you stick your nose deep in there, you're going to burn your nose out a little bit and not be able to smell much else after that. So we have a couple of techniques when it comes to nosing your whiskey.
So with nosing spirits and whiskey in particular, it's important to kind of gradually introduce the spirit to your nose. I start with this spirit down here at my chest, and I just kind of slowly raise it up, sniffing as I go, and I find that about the point that the glass reaches where my chin is, I start to perceive it. And that's where you want to start to slow down. You don't have to like stay there, but just be conscientious and slowly introduce it from that point, because as Suzanne was saying, you can very quickly and readily kind of knock your olfactory out with a high proof, high alcohol content spirit that will shut your olfactory down.
And it's nice to notice what that first note is that you are smelling. So as you're bringing it up and you don't smell anything, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I do smell something. Pausing for a minute to say, what is that? And for me right now, I'm smelling very like grainy, almost like oatmeal, like cooked grains, a little bit for that very first note. Now I know there's probably more in there for me to smell, and there's a few different techniques for us to help us get there after that first kind of notice of what you're smelling.
So as you begin to acclimate your nose to the spirit, there's a few things that you can play around with that will help you pick up on different elements of the spirit, and they relate to different components of the process of making your whiskey. There are aromas that are kind of more volatile and they're escaping the glass, and there are aromas that are heavier and they sit basically just right on the surface of the liquid. The more volatile ones tend to come from the source material. If you're drinking bourbon, that's primarily corn. If you're drinking rye, that's primarily rye. With a lot of whiskeys, it's bourbon.
And so notice he said the more volatile ones kind of come out of the glass a little more quickly. And when I first was bringing this up, the first thing I noticed was graininess, oatmeal, right? That's coming from that source material. That first thing that I noticed when it's further away from my nose, and I'm not kind of as deeply focused on it yet.
So one of the ways to more readily perceive those types of aromas is playing with the way that you smell. So the more volatile aromas need to be essentially kind of triggered in your nose rapid fire. And one of the ways to do that is breathing in and out rapidly. Kind of like a dog would sniff something.
Exactly. Kind of like a dog sniffs. If you have a dog and they kind of all around. One of the reasons they're doing that, and you'll notice, so if you listen and see Evan's glass a little bit right now, it's steaming up a tiny, tiny bit. And so dogs, when they're sniffing like that, those quick bursts, they're sniffing in and sniffing out, sniffing in and sniffing out. And what they're doing is they're adding humidity, because if they add humidity to things, it helps them find whatever they're looking for when they're smelling. And it's the same thing with whiskey. So don't be gun shy if you steam up your glass a little bit while you're doing these little dog sniffing techniques, because by adding humidity into your glass, it's going to help you find those types of aromas a little bit more easily.
Yeah, very true. Moisture is a really important component to your perception of things, for better for worse. If you've ever spent a summer in Arizona and then by contrast spent a summer in Florida, things smell a bit more ripe in Florida.
When there's humidity in the air, yes, for sure.
So the moisture content that you contribute by exhaling into the glass while you're smelling it can be very helpful.
Yeah.
Conversely, the aromas that are heavier and are not just kind of like leaping out of the glass, a fun technique, a way to be able to smell them, is tilt that glass on its side and try and bring the liquid kind of right to the edge of the rim of the glass, and then carefully, slowly raise it to your nose. And then, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, what you want to think about as you're looking at this visual of what Evan is doing is, if you're familiar with dry ice at all, and those vapors kind of fall over the edge of whatever container they're in, that's the same idea. These kind of heavier aromas are kind of wafting down, and you're catching them essentially in your nose as they're coming by. That's why this technique is so helpful. And you look like a cool person who knows what you're doing. Your friends will be like, what are you doing? And then you'll explain to them. And then you're like, I know all about how to nose whiskey.
So by doing this, you're able to get your nose really close to the surface of the liquid where those heavier aromatics sit. And then if you, again, vary the way that you smell things, and in this case, you want to do a long, slow sustained inhalation.
Your yoga breath, if you will, or your meditation breath.
The heavy odorants that sit right on the surface that aren't as volatile need a more sustained presence in your olfactory in order for your nose to perceive them. They have to be there kind of in perpetuity for a little while, as opposed to like multiple triggers when you're doing those dog sniffs.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I do this in this whiskey, so originally and when I did those kind of smaller sniffs, I was getting the graininess. This now I'm getting some coffee kind of notes and some like almost chicory and like caramel kind of notes off of that.
So not surprisingly, when you think about it, and maybe when I say it, but these brighter, more volatile, lighter aromas that your nose picks up better when it's further away from the spirit and when you're doing those multiple repeated inhalations are described more readily with adjectives that are more floral, citrus, brighter, lighter, grain, cereal.
Yeah.
And then by contrast, those heavier aromas are things like coffee, molasses, chocolate, leather, tobacco.
And can you guess where those are coming from? So if the previous ones we were talking about are coming from the source material, these other ones that need a little bit of a longer, more sustained inhale in order to find are coming more from kind of the aging process or, the barrel, things of that nature. So if, and this is often, this kind of goes to a lot of people think like the older the whiskey, the better, right? That's a very common kind of belief out there. But the older the whiskey, the more you're going to get those vanilla, caramel, coffee, chicory kind of heavier notes to it because it's in the barrel longer. Whereas if you really like those kind of floral, grainy, citrus notes to your whiskey, you actually might prefer a younger whiskey because it doesn't have as much barrel aging. So being able to identify with your nose a little bit, like what's going on there, gives you some clues as to what's happening with that particular whiskey and if it's going to fit your flavor profile.
Very true. Very true. Next up, take a sip. And when you do so, it's important that you leave the spirit in your mouth for a little while. The initial impact that is going on when you take a sip is just kind of shocking your palate, and you don't really truly get to taste the whiskey until 4 to 5 seconds pass. And even then, we would both, I think, advise that you try not to pass judgment or decide one way or another whether or not you like the whiskey on that first sip and that
Never trust your first sip. That is one of my cardinal rules. Never trust your first sip. Never trust your first bite. Because really, like Evan was saying, that first sip is, especially with spirits, especially with high proof spirits like this, it is really just your mouth being like, whoa, alcohol, like what's happening, right? And so it's reactionary. It's hard to assess it properly.
Yeah. So after you do that, and if you can manage this, it's kind of a challenge, but I often try to encourage people to think of their first sip as essentially like a primer coat.
Yeah.
You're seasoning your palate. You're not really tasting and enjoying and evaluating just yet. On the second sip, do that again. Leave it in your mouth. Do what Suzanne was doing and kind of move it around
a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a difference here. You don't want to do like the Listerine swish, right? Remember those commercials where they were like doing like really crazy, because that's going to aerate it, and what that's going to do is it's going to make that alcohol burn increase a little bit, just like with that mouthwash, it burns a lot. You really want to like chew it more, and you want to, the idea is you want to get it to touch every part of your mouth, and the fronts of your gums, the sides of your cheeks, the roof of your mouth, underneath your tongue, because you're trying to get your entire mouth acclimated. So it's not a fast swishing, it's more of a chewing. And actually in Kentucky, I believe they do call this the Kentucky chew when you're tasting bourbon. But we really recommend this for all types of alcohol for your first and maybe even second sip.
Yeah, I'll take that sip and I'll kind of gently use my tongue to push it up into the roof of my mouth and let it kind of cascade down my cheeks and pool up between my cheeks and my gums, and then swish it into the inside of my mouth underneath my tongue, and then kind of roll it forward and back, and then swallow it. And it takes like 4 to 5 seconds, but it really kind of gently coats.
4 to 5 seconds, to be clear, not 45 seconds, just
yeah.
because we do want to say this is high proof. So if it starts to feel burny in your mouth, you've done it long enough, because you also don't want to burn out your palate. You don't want to like completely destroy your mouth. So it's relatively quick, but important.
On that note, and that's a really good introduction, there's a really important role that saliva plays in tasting things.
Yeah.
It not only acts as a conduit to transmit flavors from whatever you put in your mouth to your taste buds, but it also acts as a protective layer and coating to the inside of your mouth, and it's a really vital component of digestion. So incorporating your saliva into anything that you put in your mouth is highly advised, both for the enjoyment of it and the consumption of it. Yes. Yeah. And in particular with things like spirits or anything that's high acid or spicy, saliva is going to act as like a buffer, and it's going to
protect your mouth essentially. Yeah. And so actually, especially if you're new to whiskey tasting, where you don't drink spirits straight very often, it can be a good idea to kind of get that saliva flowing in your mouth a little bit before you take your first sip.
Before you take that first sip.
Yeah, because that will help protect your mouth a little bit and get you prepared for it.
Take use of that. Let the saliva mix with the whiskey, and as you swish it around, see how the flavors that you might have expected from the way you were perceiving it from when you were smelling it, how they transmit and follow, or perhaps how they don't.
And neither of those are a bad thing, by the way.
Sure.
Like, it can be really fun to smell a whiskey and then take a sip of it and be like, oh my gosh, that tastes exactly how I thought it was going to taste, and I'm really excited about that. But it can also be equally as fun to smell something and think maybe you're not going to like it, or maybe you're really going to like whatever, and then you take a sip and it totally tastes different than what you thought. And those are the times when it makes sense to slow down a little bit and kind of back up through these steps and like pay a little more attention to it.
Couple other things, as you're experiencing the way the whiskey tastes, paying attention to the tactile sensations that you're experiencing on top of what you're tasting. So the drying sensation, the heat from the alcohol, anything else other than like actual taste perceptions are important to make note of. Not only for like determining whether or not you like them or not, but really as they connect to your ability to, going forward, describing what you like and being able to ask for something like, I like something that has like a little bit of like astringency, and something that's been barrel aged for a long time in heavily charred barrels. It's going to give you like a kind of like a drying sensation on the inside of your mouth, and some people really like that and some people don't, but it's a personal preference. So,
and on that note, it's also important, we're big believers in never saying anything like, I only like bourbon, I don't like rye, or vice versa, right? Like, we're big believers in never completely opting out of a category of alcohol, because we really do feel like the better you can learn about your own palate, the better you can assess and use some of these techniques to say, this is what I like about this whiskey, this is what I don't like about this whiskey, will help you then explain to bartenders, bottle shop owners, distillers, whatever, and say to them, this is what I really love in my whiskey, without having to categorize yourself as a rye enthusiast or a bourbon enthusiast. And really, because you might be surprised. You might think you're a bourbon drinker, and you might explain to someone what you're looking for in a whiskey, what you really love about whiskey, and they might say, you know what, you should try this rye. And you might love that rye, but you would have never asked for it because you don't think you like rye, you think you like bourbon. And that's why it's so important to really take a little time with this and not just say, I don't like this whiskey, but understand, what don't you like about this whiskey? Is there anything at all that you do like about this whiskey? And that's what these techniques can really help you do. And then our last step,
last but not least,
after you taste it a couple of times, remember, don't ever trust your first sip.
Swallow, savor, sip, spit.
And this is a step.
And at this point, you're paying attention to how the impressions of the spirit when it was in your mouth, when you were smelling it, linger. How long they persist.
Yeah.
The finish of a spirit, it's often referred to as, is a really good indicator of the overall quality, and something that continues to be enjoyable on your palate, in your olfactory. Once you've taken that sip, you've swished it around, you've swallowed it, and you've set the glass down, it's going to be there for a little while, for better, for worse, and hopefully for better. And that's what we're looking to promote and advocate for. But paying attention to that is an important step as well.
Yeah, and if you swallow it down and you find yourself 30 seconds later kind of being like, there's kind of like a weird bitterness in my mouth, or there's something going on there that I don't like, that's what Evan was saying before, where like something's out of balance a little bit. And so pay attention to that, right? Like, because being able to differentiate between this is a quality product, but I don't like it because of these things, this is what I don't like about it, versus, like just saying like, I don't like it and not being able to acknowledge that, but it's a good quality product and it's made well and I can appreciate that. That's what makes you a great taster, right? To be able to differentiate what you like versus what's good quality and what's well made, and being able to appreciate and give kudos to the maker for making a beautiful product, even if it doesn't perfectly fit your flavor profile. And again, being able to decide what your flavor profile is and how you can find more of those delicious whiskeys that you have. And as you're working through some of these techniques, we don't do this every time we have a dram of whiskey. Certainly there are some times where we just want a whiskey. But we do tend to do these techniques when it's something new that we've never had before, right? We pause, we slow down a little bit, we have a conversation about it, we talk about what he's tasting, what I'm tasting. I try to find what he's smelling and tasting. He tries to find what I'm smelling and tasting. Or if it is one of those break your neck moments where you smell something, you think it's going to taste like this, and it brings you in this direction, then again, we pause and we talk about that a little bit.
Sometimes if you happen to be snacking on something,
that's a great one.
You take a sip of the whiskey and you're like, hey, wait a minute, that's weird. Let me circle back here.
Yeah.
That's when it's worthwhile, I think, to remember these techniques, these steps again: sight, swirl, sniff, sip, savor.
And really, the sniff, if we can double down on one of them, that's probably the one that we would say, don't skip over that. Don't drink out of the bottle. Don't drink, pour it into a glass, spend a little time with your
But what
nose
if
there.
it's Monday?
I mean, if you need a flask and you're at a thing, like, all right, that's a different drinking occasion. But, 90%, I think it is the stat, something like that, 80%, 90% of what you taste is your nose. So if you're skipping on that step and you're not spending a little bit of time with your nose in the glass, you're missing out on some of those beautiful flavors that you paid good money to enjoy. And you're not giving it the fair shot that it deserves either. So spend a little bit of time with that. If you need some help, there are aroma wheels online that you can find, and those are really helpful to get you from grainy to something more specific, or
this
fruity
is oats
to something more specific.
This is lemon.
Right. And is it preserved lemon? Is it fresh lemon? Is it lemon meringue pie?
Is this
right?
Oatmeal or an oat snack bar from Hidden Valley that I grew up on. Oats and honey.
Exactly. And it really, especially when you're at home and you're drinking, this is a way to take drinking to an elevated level and travel a little bit with your drink and have an experience with your drink. There are times when we just want to pour something and watch a Netflix movie and not think about it, but it allows us to appreciate and spend a little bit of quality time with our drinks and with each other and really think about what we're drinking and have an even more immersive experience. So hopefully these tasting techniques help you do just that. If you have any questions at all, always feel free to reach out to us or comment below. Otherwise, cheers.